Okay, so good morning. Today's daf is daf Dalid in Maseches Zevachim. We are near the top of Dalid Amud Aleph, about 6 or 7 lines down. Let me share my screen and we'll really get started. So, yesterday, and again, Masechet Tzvachim is the first Masechet in Kodshim, where we begin to discuss sacrifices. And we've been discussing a variety of sacrifices. Our opening Mishnah noted that you need to have the right intention. That if you think that if you're offering one particular kind of sacrifice, whether an ola, a shlamim, etc., you have to have in mind that sacrifice. Now, we also learned that even if you don't have in mind, it can still be a sufficient sacrifice, but with the exception of a chatas, a sin offering, and the Pesach offering on at its proper time, those two don't work if you have the wrong korban in mind. But yesterday we provided the source for the requirement that the slaughter of the animal needs to be for its own sake. You need to have in mind the slaughtering of, if it's a shlamim, then you have to have in mind the slaughtering of a shlamim. If it's a chadz, you have to have in mind the slaughtering of a chatas, etc. So whatever sacrifice it is, you have to have it in mind. Now, there are a total of 4 blood-related steps of an offering, all of which are mandatory. They are the slaughtering of the animal, the receiving of the blood in a special vessel, and then bringing that blood to the altar, and then throwing the blood or sprinkling the blood or spreading the blood on the altar. And those are the 4 steps. So we've proven that you need to have the right intention for the first of those steps. Obviously, you can't receive the blood, bring the blood, or throw the blood until the animal has been slaughtered. So we've got the first one. Having proven the need for the first to be for its own sake, as we pick up at the beginning of the 7th line on Dalet Amud Aleph, the Gemara turns to the other 3. So, Ashkechan Zvicha, we see that in fact you need to have slaughtering for the right intention. Shara Vodos Minalan. How do I know about the other services? Namely, bringing the blood, throwing the blood, receiving the blood, bringing the blood, and throwing the blood. And if you say, hey, all right, so answer number 1 could be, although the phraseology of the Gemara indicates that it's not likely to be the successful answer. But if you say, well, let's just learn it from slaughtering, meaning these are all 4 mandatory actions. We have the rule by 1, so let's assume that it's going to be true by the others. Now, that would be a valid method of learning if they were all analogous in all other respects. But but there's something unique about slaughtering. If on Pesach you have in mind somebody who's not supposed to be eating, and now we're not talking about a non-owner, but somebody who's not supposed to eat, Rashi tells us, fourth line down now, the last of the wide lines in Rashi on the top of Dalet Amud Aleph, she'im shachtu shelo la'ochlin, if you slaughter that animal for Pesach for not one of the eaters, Kigon L'chola, meaning he does own it, because if he's not one of the owners, then that would be a problem for all sacrifices, and that would be a problem for all stages. But this is, we're dealing with somebody who's officially part of the group, but is not, but he's sick, uzakein, or he's elderly. She'ein yachon le'achol kazayas pasul va'afilu hein ba'alav. Even if they are one of the owners, that if you have in mind somebody who's unable to eat the full portion, then it's not considered a valid slaughtering. It's really quite remarkable. And so that's a unique aspect with respect to slaughtering that doesn't exist with respect to receiving the blood, bringing the blood, or throwing the blood.
So if it was a tamei lanefesh, and he didn't and someone slaughtered for him, and a person who did the slaughtering didn't realize that.
Yeah, that, you know what, that could be also a case. So Ella Amar Kra, So as a result, we need a new situation. So that a new proof with respect to the other avodot. And so now we're going to say, the Torah says, Hamakriv es hadam hashlamim, one who offers the blood of the shlamim. Now, if I were to just tell you, well, that's going to be a proof text, what is that a proof text for? Most people, myself included, would say, oh, that's a proof text for the bringing of the blood. That's the third of the four stages. But the Gemara says, Shetehe Kabbalah l'shem shlamim. And that pasuk teaches us that the receiving needs to be for the sake of the shlamim. So Rashi explains how it's going to be. Hamakriv Kabbalahu, that when we refer to makriv at that moment in the pasuk, it must be referring to some kind of accepting. Diktanya v'hikrivu, because we're going to see in a moment that the word hikrivu can also mean zeh kabbalas adam. It could mean receiving of the blood. We're going to see a brisa that highlights that point. And what's the proof? Meaning, why in the world would I say that it has to be intentional? Because the entire set of psukim that's right there is talking about the shlamim. It didn't need to include the word hashlamim. It could have just said hamakriv es dam, because it would be known what kind of korban you're talking about because of the context of shlamim. So because it says hashlamim, it tells us that it has to be specifically intentional for the right korban. So the lichtav rachmanim bekabbalah v'leilev shchita mina. All right, so we saw that you can't learn from slaughtering to all the others, but maybe we can learn from the receiving of the blood to the slaughtering. And so that way we won't need it, and therefore we would have an extra drasha that we could do for something, use for something else. No, we can't do that. Mishum de'ika lemichrach, because you could ask the following. Ma lekabbalah shekain psula bizar, and the word ve'isha is taken out by the Shita Mekubetzes, that when it comes to the receiving of the blood, you cannot, a non-Kohen cannot do it. Now, again, the reason that it takes out the woman is because we're about to say that the non-Kohen can do the slaughtering, and a woman can't do slaughtering, certainly not in Beis Hamikdash. So when it says when it comes to receiving the blood, that cannot be done by a non-Kohen. But the point is that the slaughtering can be done by a non-Kohen, and so as a result, this is an aspect in which the slaughtering is less strict. And so because it's less strict, you may say that just because something is required for receiving the blood, meaning the intentional aspect that it needs to be with the right korban in mind, maybe it isn't necessary for shchita. So therefore we need to learn shchita separately. So Ashkechan Shchita v'Kabbalah. So we've now shown that both slaughtering and Kabbalah and receiving the blood are required intention. You have to have in mind the right korban. Zrika minalan. So how about throwing? How do I know that? And if you say, well, let's learn it from the other two. Well, that doesn't work because malahani shekain to unas tzafun. The other two require the person to be standing in the north side, north of the mizbeach, but v'yeshnan bechatos hapnimis, and it's also those two apply even to the inner chatas, meaning the chatas that has its blood put on the inner altar. But though that does not apply, but to the inner altar sin offerings don't have sprinkling on the outer altar, and so both of these things don't apply to the to sprinkling, and so as a result, you can't learn from slaughtering and receiving blood to the throwing of the blood. Ella Amrkra Hazorik as Damashlamim. So just as we saw with respect to the Kabbalah, we also see with respect to the throwing that it says specifically that you throw the blood of the shlamim, zrika l'shem shlamim. So that teaches us that the throwing needs to be intentional for the shlamim. The lichtov rachamana. So Rabbi So why not let it write just in connection with throwing? V'leilef mina, and we'll learn from the others, because again, so far all we've seen is that the others have strictures that are not true with respect to throwing. So maybe we can learn from throwing to everything else. No, we'd have a problem. Mishum de'ika lemifrach ma lezrika shechein chayav ala hazar misa. When it comes to zrika, the throwing, unlike the other aspects, if a non-Kohen were to throw the blood onto the altar, he would be subject to death at the hands of uh, um, uh, uh, um, the death at the hands of heaven, and that would not be true with respect to slaughtering. And so, as a result, as Rashi says, Zrika zar chayav alav misa, aval shchita ksheira bizar. The Kabbalah v'holaka aval piship psula bizar ein chayav alav misa. So when it comes to the other three steps, although when it comes to the receiving and the bringing, you're not allowed to do it, and it would ruin the korban. You're not subject to the death penalty. And when it comes to slaughtering, slaughtering can be done by somebody who's a non-Kohen. So again, we see that there is a strict an aspect of the throwing that is stricter than the other three blood services. And so as a result, we can't learn from throwing the blood to the other three services.
Why do we skip halicha?
What?
Why did we skip halicha?
We're going to see, well, we're going to do it right now, and the answer will help understand why we skipped it. So Ashkan Kulo. So we found all of them. Now, of course, it's not literally all of them, because we did slaughtering, receiving, and throwing. Holacha minalan. How do I know about bringing? And if you say, well, let's just learn it from all three of the other ones. Malakulu shekain, we can't do that, because malakulu shekain avoda she'efshar levatla. The other three, there is no way to escape doing it. You have to slaughter the animal, otherwise there's no blood. You have to receive the blood in a vessel, in a vessel of the Beis Hamikdash, and if you don't do that, it's not valid. Meaning you need, and because then you're going to throw the blood. So you need to do that, and you need to throw the blood onto the altar. But what don't you need to do? You don't necessarily, depending on where you slaughter the animal, need to bring the blood to the mizbeach, because the mizbeach may be within throwing distance of where you slaughtered it, and so then there would be no bringing. So tomar b'holacha she'efshar levatla. So as a result, that's a strict aspect of all the other three offerings that doesn't exist with respect to bringing the blood, which we can potentially avoid. As Rashi says, holacha efshar levatla, right opposite the Torah or Hashalem on the right-hand side of the page, she'im ratza shoche pitzad hamizbeach, that if you wanted to, you slaughter the animal right by the mizbeach, b'zorek, and then throw from there, kedetanya b'masnisin, as we are going to see in the Mishnah on Daf Yud Gimel Amud Aleph. Okay, Ella Amakra. So how do we bring the proof with respect to the receiving? So v'hikriv es hakol hamizbecha. So we're going to, the Torah says, this is a pasuk in Vayikra, Perak Aleph Yud Gim, pasuk Yud Gimel, that you should bring all of it on the altar. Amar Mar, Zo holacha evarim lakevesh. That this bringing, the hikriv, is referring to bringing the limbs to the ramp. Now that's piece number one of the proof. That alone is not a proof, because that's not talking about bringing the blood. That's talking about bringing the limbs of the slaughtered animal. Vitanya, second piece of the proof that in itself is also not a proof. Vihikrivu, we saw, this is the brisa that we referenced earlier. Zu kabbalas hadam. The word hikrivu in the pasuk in Perek Aleph Pasuk Hey, which says V'shachad es ben habakar lifnei Hashem, that the animal is, he shall slaughter the bull before Hashem. V'hikrivu b'nei Aaron haKohanim es adam v'zarku, and the Kohanim shall bring the blood and throw the blood. Now, what is skipped there? Skipped there is the receiving of the blood. You can't have the throwing of the blood before the receiving of the blood. And so we see that receiving is connected to the bringing, because the hikrivu is effectively capturing the receiving of the blood. Va'apik rachmana b'loshan halacha. So even though the next step after slaughtering must be receiving, and so when we say the hikrivu in pasuk hey in the first parak of Vayikra, it must be some aspect of receiving, even though hikrivu means to bring. So, and now that we see that hikrivu, which means bring, is also being used to be receiving, the apik rachmana b'loshan holacha. We learned using the language of holacha, of bringing. We learned about receiving. So lememra de holacha lo tapka miklal kabbalah, that whatever applies to receiving is going to apply to bringing. And so because we are effectively learning these two items together, that's why I think the Gemara sort of covers it last. It doesn't have its own drasha. It effectively uses and is derivative of the drasha for receiving, for Kabbalah. Okay, so
so so if a person if he's next to the mizbeach and he shechs the animal, collects the blood, and he just throws it on the mizbeach, is it an unfulfilled?
No, that's valid. That's valid. Even though effectively if you do these steps, they all have to have the proper intention. And 3 of the steps are absolutely required. That's 1, 2, and 4, the
Right.
slaughtering, the receiving, and the
Right.
throwing. Number 3, as we saw, is not necessarily required, but in most circumstances, it will be required. Okay. So what we've seen now so far, I'm sorry, let me scroll the screen. Okay. What we've seen now is that you need to have in mind the right sacrifice, namely, we've learned all of this from Shlomim. But you need to have if you're bringing a Shlomim, you need to have in mind a Shlomim when you do the slaughtering, when you do the receiving, when you do the bringing, and when you do the throwing. Okay? So Ashkechan Shinoi Kodesh. We found that. Shinoi Balam Minalan. How do I know that you need to have the right owner in mind, right? And the reason that we know that this is that you have to have the right korban in mind is because of that repetition of the word shlomim, right? We saw that in 2 of the lessons, and yesterday we saw it also when it came to im zevach shlamim, when that there too it referenced the word shlamim next to zevach, and it didn't need to mention zevach. So as a result, we end up with 3 lessons of shlamim next to actions, and those actions from those 3 we can from one of the 3, namely the fact that we use the word makriv in order to be receiving the blood, we learn makriv from receiving. We learn the bringing from the receiving, and so we've got all 4. But all 4 had the word shlomim next to it. But what about the owner? How do I know that the owner's got to be the right guy? That we have to have him in mind. So Amar Rav Pinchas Brei Rav Ami Amar Kra Uvisar Zevach Toda Shlamav. That it says that the meat of the Zevach Toda, that is his shlamim, shetehei zvicha l'shem Toda. Im eno inyan. Now, so what does that tell us? It tells us with respect to, it doesn't necessarily say anything about having the right guy in mind. It says that you need to have the slaughtering. Again, we have uvasar zevach, the slaughtering. Toda shlamav has to be for the Toda. because that we're again referencing the Zevach unnecessarily, just as we referenced the Zevach with respect to Shlomim, and we said that that means that you need to slaughter for a Shlomim. This means that you need to slaughter for a Toda. But we already know that you need to slaughter for the right Korban because we had Zevach Shlomim. So im eino inyan l'shinoi kodesh. So if we don't need it in order to tell us that you can't change the nature of the korban, that you can't have in mind the wrong korban type. Denavgalan mihasam, because we saw it already above from Zevach Shlamim to Neu Inyan L'Shinoi Balim. So we now have the ability to use it to tell us something very similar, namely that you can't change, you can't have in mind the wrong owner. Well, the high lahachiuda asa. How do you know that it's coming to teach us that law? We have a brisa that uses that same pasuk to teach us something else. And what does it say? Uvasar zevach todah shlamav, again citing the same pasuk, the meat of the zevach todah that is his shlamim. Abba Chanin Omer Mishum Rabbi Eliezer. Balalamed, what does this come to teach us? Toda sheshachta l'shem shlamim kshera. That if in fact you have in mind when you slaughter the toda that you're slaughtering a shlamim, that's going to be okay. Sheshlamim sheshchat, that's going to be kosher because this pasuk is telling us that a toda is a kind of shlamim. But shlamim sheshachta l'shem toda psula. But if you slaughter a shlamim with having in mind a toda, that doesn't work. So ma hefresh ben zelazeh. What's the difference between the two cases? Toda keruya shlamim. This pasuk is showing that a toda is called a shlamim. Ve'ein shlamim keruya toda. So if we use our lessons of Venn diagrams, if we use our lessons of Venn diagrams, the circle for shlamim includes the circle of toda, but does not consist only of the toda, whereas the toda is solely within the shlamim. And so as a result, if you have in mind with respect to a toda, it's a shlamim. So you could have in mind a shlamim instead of a toda. But if in fact you were bringing a shlamim, it's not by definition called a toda also, and therefore, in fact, a toda has more restrictive rules. You have to eat it faster, and so as a result, that's not going to work. And so we've learned from this pasuk a different lesson. So how can we learn the fact that, how can we say that Zevach Toda is teaching us that you have to have in mind the right owner when that pasuk is teaching us something else? So
there's more than one type of shlomim.
What?
We're saying there's more than one type of shlamim. So
yes,
shlamim.
The toda is a version of the shlamim. So there's the shlamim, and right. There are more than one kind of shlamim because there's also a shlamim of the tzibur, etc. Right. So, but that's exactly right. There's more than one
specific form. This is one specific form.
Exactly, and so as a result, that doesn't work. So, but therefore, how can we learn from this pasuk? That's the question that we bring using that brisa. So, anan mizeva kamrinan. Yeah, you're right. The language of toda and shlamim have been used in that brisa, but the language of zevach, which is what we're using, zevach toda, is not used. And so as a result, that shows that we can learn both lessons. But when second, we need the word zevach for a different purpose, because take a look at the following brisa. Chatas v'asham minayin. How do I know that a sin offering and an asham offering, when a kohen can eat them, the kohen eats them for only 1 day and 1 night? Talmud Lomar, zevach, because the word zevach is used in connection with both chatas and asham, and is extra here. So as a result, we're going to say that it teaches us that those other korbanos are also eaten, just like a toda is eaten for a day and a night. So too, those other korbanos are eaten for a day and a night. Well, im kain. So again, we now have used every word in this pasuk. So im kain nichtav kra uvasar toda shlamav zevach. That it should have said that the meat of the toda is going to be his shlomim and is going to be a zevach and is going to be slaughtered. And so as a result, then we would say that we would only learn the lesson about Zevach teaching us by the Chatas and Asham that they could be eaten by the same time limit. So my Zevach, why does it specifically say Zevach Todah first, meaning it says Ubasar Zevach Todas Shlamav? Why does it put it reverse the order? Shma Minat Tarti. So that's, we can learn essentially two different things. So, okay. So we've now confirmed we found a source for slaughtering. Ashkechan Zvika. We found a source for slaughtering with the right person in mind. What about the other services? So Shar Avodos Minalan. How do I know that when it comes to receiving the blood, bringing the blood, and throwing the blood, that they also need to have the right person in mind? And if you want to say, well, okay, well, let's just learn it from slaughtering. Again, we say exactly what we said before. We have a problem because there's a strictness about slaughtering that it cannot be done for the somebody who's unable to eat the Korban Pesach for a Pesach offering. So as a result, that strictness associated with it may imply that there's other strictnesses associated with Zvika, namely that you have to have in mind the right person. So we wouldn't learn from that case to the other cases. So Nemra Zvicha Beshinoi Kodesh, V'Nemra Zvicha Beshinoi Baalim, Ma Zvicha Amura Beshinoi Kodesh, Lo Chilakta Ben Zvicha L'Shar Avodos, Av Zvicha L'Amura Beshinoi Baalim, Lo Tzichalek Behen Ben Zvicha L'Shar Avodos. Well, why don't we say the following? Just as when it comes to slaughtering, you have to have in mind both the right sacrifice and the right person. And when it comes to having in mind the right sacrifice, we don't differentiate between slaughtering and the receiving, the bringing, and the throwing. So maybe we should say the same thing with respect to having in mind the right person. So again, same basic concept that we're going to try and learn from Zvicha, but we're combining it with the learning that we already did with respect to having in mind the right korban. But no, that also won't work. Because Ika Lamifrach, you can say that there's the following: Mala Shinoi Kodesh Shekaim Psula Begufa. When it comes to changing in having in mind the wrong sacrifice, that we're going to say is invalidating the sacrifice itself, as opposed to some kind of outer invalidation. But we're going to reject that in a moment. V'yeshno ba'arba avodos, and it applies to all four avodos exactly the same. Namely, we'll see what that means in a moment as well. V'yeshno la'achar misa. In addition, it applies even after the death of the owner. V'yeshno b'tzibor kiv'yachid. And it applies to the community just as it applies to an individual. So let's take a look at Rashi. Rashi is going to help us with respect to understanding each of these three cases. So three of these four cases. Again, the first case we're going to reject in a moment. But v'yeshno, it's the last word in the last narrow line, and we're going to then do the next two Rashis with it. So keep your finger on Rashi, and we'll go back into the Gemara in a moment. V'yeshno ba'arba avodos. So she'im shachat shelo lishmo. If I slaughter the animal not for the right sacrifice, so I have in mind a chatas when it's actually a shlomim, o kibel, or I received it with that same intention, v'halach, or I brought the blood with that same intention, v'zarak, or I threw the blood shelo lishmo for the wrong korban, af al pi shelo chishev ella al hashchita shelo lishmo, even though the only thing I did was say at each moment, whether I was receiving, bringing, or throwing, the thought that I had was not about doing that action, shelo lishma, that I was doing that action for the wrong thing, but rather I was always thinking back to the fact that my slaughtering was done for a different korban, pasul. In all four cases, that each of those is going to be insufficient. Meaning, let's say I actually have in mind the right korban when I slaughtered it. So I had in mind a shlomim for the shlomim. And now I am about to receive the blood. And now, or I'm bringing the blood. Again, I guess I couldn't do it because I'm not a Kohen, but the Kohen is doing that. And now the Kohen has in mind that the slaughtering was done for the wrong korban, that instead of for shlomim it was a chatas. So as a result, it's going to be invalid. That's going to cause a problem. Kederavinan lahu la'el, as we saw earlier, abal shinoi ba'alim. But when it comes to having in mind the wrong owner, lo shayach ella bizrika. The only one that you can have in mind the wrong thinking about doing the thing for the wrong owner, and it will cause a problem with respect to everything else, is when it comes to throwing. Tahara diravinan shchita lifsel b'shinoi balim Eino ella kigon sheshachas almanas lizrok lehiskaper bo acher. That when it comes to the slaughtering, it's not that I'm slaughtering Shlomo's sacrifice instead of Joe's sacrifice. It's that I'm slaughtering it with the intention to throw the blood for Shlomo, instead of for Joe. Aval shachas shelo l'shem bala. But what Rashi is telling us is that when we say that you slaughtered it for the wrong person, we mean you slaughtered it with the intention to sprinkle for the wrong, to throw the blood for the wrong person. But if you just slaughtered thinking it was Shlomo's sacrifice instead of Joe's sacrifice, below his care, almanas lizrok, and you didn't think about that you were doing it in order to throw it for the wrong person, ein zu machshava deshinoi balim. That is not considered having in mind the wrong owner. And lo shayak b'karban el hiskaper bo. The whole concept is that you have to have, it's the kapara that makes the difference, bo. The kapara bizrikahi. And that atonement happens at the moment of the throwing, which is the last of the 4 steps. And we'll see this later in our parak on Daf Yud Amud Aleph. Shim Amar Hareini Shochas L'Shem Ploni Kasher. That if I say, "Oh, I'm slaughtering for Shlomo," it's actually kosher. So we have to modify everything that we learned yesterday and the day before. That when we say we have in mind the wrong person, it does not mean that I'm just slaughtering it for the wrong person. It doesn't mean that I just think that this korban belongs to Shlomo. I have to think to myself that when I'm slaughtering it, I'm going to sprinkle it for Shlomo. And I have to think that when I'm going to bring it, I'm going to receive the blood, I'm receiving the blood because I want to sprinkle it for Shlomo. And if I'm bringing the blood, it's because I'm bringing the blood because I want to sprinkle it for Shlomo. And of course, if I'm sprinkling it for Shlomo. So that's what we mean when we say Shelo Lishmo.
So he has to
Shelo
be
L'Shem
thinking.
Ba'alav, excuse me.
So throughout the entire process, this Kohen has to be thinking about the sprinkling.
No, again, we've already learned that stam is fine.
Right.
It's if he's thinking about the sprinkling, he better be thinking about the right guy.
So he doesn't have to be thinking,
but he doesn't have to be thinking about it. No, because stam is fine. So let's just finish this Rashi. L'shem ploni kasher shachto almanas lizrok l'shem ploni. But if you slaughter the animal in order to throw the blood in order to for Shlomo instead of Joe, pasul, then it's going to be pasul. The kain la'inyan kabbalah beholach, and the same thing applies with respect to the receiving and the bringing. And lo shayach shinoi bala. And so the key moment when it comes to thinking that you've got the wrong the wrong guy, is the throwing. And so as a result, that is different with respect to having in mind the wrong guy from having in mind the wrong korban. When it comes to having in mind the wrong korban, you can have in mind the wrong korban at any of the stages. Okay, and so that's the difference. So as a result,
then it would be puzzle. If you had the wrong korban in mind, any state, it would be puzzle, right?
Correct.
Now, how specific is? I'm just curious. How specific is the Baal? Because often we say Ishu Beito, referring to his whole family. Does it have to be for him, or can we include do we include his wife, his son? I mean,
that's an excellent question. I'm not actually sure of the answer. Let's continue to go through the Masechah together, and we'll see whether we can come up with an answer of whether ishto kagufo, and therefore we would say that that's also sufficient. But you're absolutely right. It's an excellent question. I do not know the answer. If we don't come to an answer, let's try and remember the question, and we'll try and find an answer at the end. But hopefully the Gemara will also think of that question and help us understand what the answer is. Presumably, if you're talking about adult children, that would obviously be a different household at that point. But for if you have in mind the minor child or the wife, is that considered sufficient? Again, my guess is with the wife is that it might be, but the children would probably not. But that's why, again, the Gemara tells us that the rabbi specifically encouraged everybody to think stam, that they don't think about who's involved, because that way you're going to be better off. All right, so we turn to Dalet and Bet. V'af agavta tarti lav dafka, tarti miya dafka. Even though actually two of the 4 points that we just made are not quite right. What are the two that are not quite right? Mashna shinui balam delo havi psula begufo. Why are you telling me that having in mind the wrong owner is not a problem with the sacrifice itself? Machshava ba'alma. It's a machshava. It's a thought. And shinui kodesh nami machshava ba'almahu. It's similarly, having in mind the wrong sacrifice is also just a thought. And so ela kevan da'achshava psala. Hakinami kevan da'achshava psala. There's no difference between the two. So actually, the reason number one of the 4 reasons, which is the invalidation of the sacrifice itself, is not really accurate. And moreover, when it comes to Urav Pinchas, Breder of Bramari, Damar Yeshin Balam La'achar Misa. Actually, when it came to the item number 3 on our list, that there can be that changing the mind, the wrong carbon would applies even after the death of the owner. But the changing in mind, having in mind the wrong sacrifice, I'm sorry, having in mind the wrong sacrifice after the death of the owner creates a problem. But having in mind the wrong owner after the death of the owner would not. That's not actually true. But we didn't do the last 2 Rashis on Daf Daled and Bet, so let's go back to them. V'yeshno la'achar misa hamafrish karbano umes. That if somebody separates their carbon and then dies, v'hayorish makrivo, and the heir brings that carbon, shayach bo shinoi kodesh. It still has the rule that you can't have in mind the wrong sacrifice. Aval lo shinoi balim. But according to some opinions, we'll see, not everyone, there's no violation by having in mind the wrong owner. Shaharei mesu balam, because the owner already died. So there is no right owner. He's just bringing the carbon because it was been set aside. V'yeshno b'tzibor, and then again, when it comes to the tzibor, aval shinoi balam, there again you can have the wrong sacrifice problem, but you can't have the wrong owner problem, because aval shinoi balam lo shayach b'karban tzibor shareya kol ba'alav. Everybody is considered the owner, and so as a result, that's the story. That may be a touch on the answer to your question of, do we consider the wife the owner of the carbon? So maybe if the wife is bringing the carbon and the person has in mind the husband, that would almost certainly work, because usually everything that the wife has is owned also by the husband. But whether it goes in the other direction, that we still again have to discover. That's the good question that Ken was asking. So all right, so we've now seen that 2 of the answers aren't really true, but the other 2 of the 4 points, tarta mia ika lemifrach, and that's, we are now back into the Gemara. 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7 lines down, first word on the line, tarta mia ika lemifrach. But the other 2 questions are good questions, namely the questions of what happens if it's a communal sacrifice. That only applies the rule of having in mind the wrong sacrifice and not having in mind the wrong owner. And similarly, when it comes to your thought process, the fact that you have to be thinking about sprinkling when it comes to having in mind the wrong person, but you don't have to think about the sprinkling when it comes to having in mind the wrong sacrifice. That shows a difference between the 2 as well. So therefore we can't learn So as a result, we have to try a different answer. And Rav Ashi comes to our rescue, and we need to find another source regarding whether or not the other blood services require having in mind the right person. Ella Amar of Ashi Amar Kra V'nirtza lo lechaper alav. He's got to be accepted to gain for him atonement. V'lo al chavero. It's not for somebody else. Alav. It's got to be for him. One second, just as we asked before, we ask now in connection with this drasha. We already have a brisa that uses that word alab. V'nirtza lo lechaper alav. That again, same pasuk that Rabbi Shimon Omer. Afsha alav chayab achruyuso, that whatever is incumbent on him, so then he's going to be liable for it. So if a person says, I'm going to bring a shlamim sacrifice, and he sets aside Bessie the cow, Bessie the goat as a sacrifice for the shlamim, and then the shlamim, and now Bessie dies, and so he's going to have to bring another animal because he didn't just set aside this animal. And so as a result, because it was incumbent on him, but if he does a nedava and he says, Bessie is the one I'm going to bring as a shlamim, and then Bessie dies, he's not going to be liable for another animal as a shlamim. So we learn that from there. So Amar Rav Yitzchak bar Abdimi, and Rav Yitzchak bar Abdimi explained, my taima came into Amar Alai because he said it's on me. Commanded ton lay akasve dummy. It's as if he put the responsibility on his shoulders. So how can we learn from there? So Rav Ashi mibenirtza lo lechaper. It's not from the alav. We thought it was from the alav. It's not from that. He's learning it from the first three words. The nirtza lo lechaper kamar. It's the acceptance shall be gained for him. So as a result, that's why we know. All right, but that's talking about when it comes to that. Those words in that pasuk are talking about Ashkechan, Zvicha, Uzricha. That's talking about the throwing, because that's the moment that gains atonement, as we saw in Rashi. So with this drasha of V'nirtza lo lechaper is about the throwing. What about kabla minala? How about receiving? So v'chitema leila of mizvicha uzrika, and you say, okay, well, let's learn it from slaughtering and throwing. Malazvicha uzrika, we can't do that. Shekena bodas shechayavim alem b'chutz. Those things, slaughtering and throwing, creates liability for kares if you do them outside the base of Mikdash. The other things you're not allowed to do outside the base of Mikdash either, but if you do them, you're not subject to kares. So Ella Amar of Ashi, Asya Me'el Nazir. Okay, so we're going to learn it from the Nazir's ram. What about the Nazir's ram? Diksiv v'es ha'ayil yaseh zevach shlamim. That the Nazir's ram is going to be a zevach shlamim. Shetehei asiyato l'shem shlamim. That shows that it needs to be for a shlamim. But we already know that you can't have in mind the wrong sacrifice, that you have to have in mind the right sacrifice. So v'im eno inyan l'shino kodesh denavka mehasam, that we already saw that you can't have in mind the wrong korban, teneo inyan l'shino baum. So we'll have it in mind to tell us that you can't have in mind the wrong person. So Amrle Rav Acha bar Abba Rava ema yasek klal. Well, 1 second, maybe we could say that the word yasa in that pasuk is a generalization. Zevach prat, and zevach is a specification. So we have a klalu prat, and aim beklal elamasha beprat. That whenever we have a generalization and then a specification, so we say that you can bring any animal, or you can as a sacrifice. And then we say, no, you can only bring a bull and a goat and a sheep. So now all of a sudden, bull, goat, and sheep are the only animals that you can bring as a sacrifice. When you have klal and then a prat, that's how we learn it. If you have the other order, well, then we reverse it, and you say you could do anything. So, but the point is, and the first three are just examples. But here we have a generalization and then a specification. So maybe this is telling us only about zvicha in mida akrina lo. Maybe it's telling us that only when it comes to slaughtering, and it's specifically telling us that only slaughtering requires the right right owner intention. So no, iksiv yaseh shlamim zevach. If it had instead said, and again the pasuk said yaseh zevach shlamim, But if it had said Yaseh Shlomim Zevach Kedeka'amra, then you would be right that we have a Klal Uprat here. Because it would say Yaseh Shlomim, that's general, and Zevach, that's specific. Or Yaseh, right? But Hashd Diksiv Yaseh Zevach Shlomim, there's a problem. Havale klal she'enu malay. It's the generalization is not complete because it's referring the yaseh is on the shlamim, and so we've interrupted that generalization to put in the specification. V'kol klal she'enu malay ein danin oso b'klal prat. And when you don't have a full-fledged generalization, we don't use a generalization. We don't use the principle of klal prat. So how? So that
Why
was
is it not full? You say Yaseh Shlomim.
because it says Zevach, but between Yaseh and Shlomim. And so as a result, the Yaseh generalization isn't clear what it's referring to until we have the word Shlomim. So we need to have, if we want to say that this is a Klal Uprat, it would need, the Torah would need to say, according to this opinion, Yaseh Shlomim Zevach. And then we would have Yaseh Shlomim is the generalization, Zevach is the prat, and we would have a generalization followed by a specification.
So in this case, it's a prat to klal then, right?
No, it's an interrupted klal uprat. And so as a result, we don't have in either direction because the word Zevach has interrupted Yaseh Shlomim. So Yaseh Shlomim together would be a klal. But when they're separated, they're nothing. Okay, so Ravina provides a second possible answer.
Isn't there one of the rules is a prat to klal? So why can't we say Zevach is the prat?
But it's not there's no klal here because the prat has interrupted the description of the klal. Until we have the words Yaseh Shlomim together, we don't actually have any klal. And so because Zevach has interrupted the klal, we have no klal at all. We just have the prat, and there is no rule of prat. Okay.
No, but there's a prat to klal. You can't.
I know, but we don't have a klal here because we don't have Yaseh Shlomim together.
So Shlomim alone, the word Shlomim alone is not considered klal?
Is not. That's right. It's not. Apparently, is not being considered a klal itself. But Ravina Amar LaOlam Danim. Ravina disagrees and says, you know what? Even Yaseh Zevach Shlomim can be a part of a klal prat, and Yaseh is the klal and Zevach is the prat. But the LaHashem, when the pasuk continues and says LaHashem chazar v'klal, it goes back to a klal, a generalization of doing it for Hashem. Well, Amarle Rav Acha Mardivta Miravina, Rav Acha asks on Ravina's answer, V'halo dami klala kamala klala basra. But 1 second, the first klal and the last klal are different. Kala kama marabe asios v'sulo. The first klal refers to various actions, meaning the actions that one takes in order to bring the sacrifice. But kal brasra kol Hashem. But the last one is anything for Hashem. Va'afilu shvicha shirayim, that would include pouring the remnants of the blood on the base of the altar. V'haktaras emurin, and burning the sacrificial parts, which are not actually necessary steps in the bringing of a sacrifice. So Hatana debe Rabbi Yishmael v'chlale uprati darish ki hai gavna. No, when Ravina gave his answer, he was answering based on the principles that the Tana of Rabbi Yishmael's yeshiva would use even this kind of situation to do klal upratu klal. So klal upratu klal ia tadan elakain prat. And so as a result, the rule with respect to klal upratu klal is that we can use the specific items in the middle to generalize more broadly. So ma prat meforish avoda. Specifically, the specific items are necessary avoda worship pieces. Uveinan shlishman. And we need them to be for the sake of the right offering. Av kol avoda. V'inan lishman. And so too, all of the avoda needs to be done for the right sacrifice. And imap haprat meforish avoda v'chayavin aleh b'chutz. And so as a result, based on the concept of Eino Inyan, we can learn from all of them to that. So imal prat meforish avoda. So alternatively, you could say that just as the specified item is clearly an avoda, chayavin aleh b'chutz. And you're liable for it when you do it outside. Av kol avoda v'chayavin aleh b'chutz. Shchita uzrika in kabbalah v'halacha lo. 1 second. Maybe you could say that the middle items are not are not all four of the essential avoda steps, but maybe it's just the things that are required to be done inside the courtyard, and you'd be liable for car race if you did them outside, and that would apply just to the slaughtering and the throwing of the blood, but the Kabbalah v'halacha lo, and not the receiving and the conveying. Inami, or alternatively, mahaf prat meforish davar haton safun. Maybe it's something that needs to be done in the north. V'yeshnu b'chatos hapnimios, and it applies to inner chatos. Af kol haton safun. So to everything that requires to be in the north, v'yeshnu b'chatos hapnimis, and could also apply to the inner chatos. Shchita v'kabbalah in, and so then we would have the slaughtering and the receiving zrika lo, and not the throwing. So as a result, we have two alternative ways of understanding this klal prat klal, that maybe the prat is not all four, but is just some of them. So ikala meimer haki. You know what? You could say that. The ikala meimer haki, and you could say that, and therefore shkulin hein v'yavo shnein. Actually, both apply. So as a result, because you can't tell which of these limitations applies, we'll apply all of them. And we'll say that actually it applies both to slaughtering and applying the blood, and to slaughtering and receiving. And because receiving is connected to bringing, so all four will end up being covered. Lishnachrina, chada chada teko b'milsa. Or we could say, each one actually stands, that both of these logics apply. There's no, the Rishonim talk about what's going on here, but that seems to be the exact same answer. Ibayas ema zrika midarav ashi nafka. Or we could say, no, throwing the blood, we learned it from Rav Ashi's lesson above. And so as a result, the generalization, specification, the klal prat klal, is therefore used only in the second manner, in the second of the restrictive manner, meaning that it applies to the slaughtering and the receiving, and therefore also the bringing, and the throwing we learn separately. So Ashkechan El Nazir. So fine, you've now shown, based on the Nazir's Ram, Shar Shlamim Minalan. How do I know every other Shlamim? So the chitema neilif me El Nazir. So all right, so let's learn it from the El Nazir. No, you can't learn it from the El Nazir. Mala El Nazir shekain yeshiman dam macherim. No, the other ones are sorry for not scrolling. The other the sacrifice of the El Nazir comes with others. As Rashi tells us, it comes with a sin offering and an ola. So im kain nichtav shalmei. Well, 1 second, we could say shalmei there. It doesn't have to say, or shalmav, according to the Masoret Hashas. My shlamim. Why does it say shlamim? La rabos kol shlamim. It comes to teach us that all kinds of shlamim it is true for. So ashkechan shlamim, shar kol kachim minalan. How do I know that every other sacrifice? V'chitema neilif mishlamim. And you say, learn it out from a shlamim. Ma la shlamim shekain to unasmicha. Shlamim requires leaning on the animal, unisachim, and it requires other libations, utanuvas chazav ashok, and it requires the waving of the breast and the thigh. So Ella Amar Kra Zos HaTorah LaOlah LaMincha VeLaChatas LaAsham VeLaMuim LeZevach HaShlamim. This is the law. This is a pasuk in Vayikra Perek Zayin, pasuk Lamed Zayin, that this is the law of the Olah, the Mincha, the Sin offering, the Asham, the inauguration offerings, the Zevach, and the Shlamim. And so as a result, we see that all of them, Hikishan Hakasav L'Shlamim, Mal Shlamim Shinoi Kodesh Ben Shinoi L'Baalim Be'inan Lishma, Af Kol Ben Shinoi L'Kodesh Ben Shinoi Baalim Be'inan Lishma. So just as we need all of them, we essentially learn from the shlamim to all of them that you have to have in mind the right sacrifice, and they have to have in mind the right owner. So ema hacha hecha deshakat lahu shalo lishma lipaslu. So in second, so let's say that where one slaughtered them for their own sake, they should become invalidated. So you know what? Maybe we'll stop here, and we'll pick up from here, God willing, tomorrow. So what we've shown, we've proven that all sacrifices must be offered for their own sake, and why they must be offered for the right owner. But why in our Mishnah does the Mishnah not invalidate all sacrifices that are not offered for their own sake? It's required, so why not invalidate them, right? We saw that the only ones that get invalidated are a sin offering and the Pesach offering on Erev Pesach. So what about every other sacrifice? If you have in mind the wrong sacrifice, it seems like it's going to work. So why is that the case? We've just spent the whole day proving that if you have in mind the wrong sacrifice, that it's not what you're supposed to be doing. So doesn't that mean that it should be an invalid sacrifice? So that's where we'll pick up, God willing, tomorrow. Stay tuned for those details.
What did we learn again from the cloud of Prat? Which was the correct interpretation of the cloud of Prat, the Prat cloud, and the two meanings?
So we offered in the end two possibilities. We actually offered essentially three possibilities, but we're going to go with one of the more limited possibilities. So I'll scroll up because I actually bolded it because to help explain. So the first possibility is maybe the klal prato klal teaches us it only applies to slaughtering and throwing, but not receiving and bringing. And then the second possible lesson is it only applies to slaughtering and receiving and not throwing. So note in this approach, receiving blood and bringing blood are connected, as we saw previously, so bringing the blood would also be covered. So one possibility covers slaughtering, receiving, and bringing, and the other one covers slaughtering and throwing. So there are two answers to how we end up doing it. One answer is to say, you know what? We apply both of these. That because we can't tell which one to do, we end up saying both of them apply, and therefore, effectively, we end up saying that all four are covered by the klal prato klal. And the second answer is no.
Covered for what?
Covered to teach us that just as you need lishma for one, you need lishma for all of them. Yeah, I mean, so you need l'shem baal. You need to have the right owner. So as a result, just as the blood service must be offered for the right offering, so too any blood service must be done for the right owner. This should say owner. I'm going to have to fix that. So right here. So the point is that we learn from we use the klal prat uklal to tell us that just as these things require having in mind the right offering, you also have to have in mind the right owner.
But we learned earlier that the right owner only applies to the zrika, right?
So we learned that the definition of having in mind the right owner is having in mind to do the zrika for the right owner. But there are 4 points in time that you could be thinking about the throwing for the wrong owner. You could think about throwing for the wrong owner at the time of slaughtering. You could be thinking about throwing for the wrong owner at the time of receiving the blood. You could be thinking about throwing for the wrong owner at the time of bringing the blood to the altar. And you could think about throwing the blood for the wrong owner at the time that you actually throw the blood. And that's what we're saying. So you're right that the thought is about throwing for the wrong person, but when do we have that thought? And if that we have that thought at any moment of doing the 4 actions, then it's going to be an invalid korban. So that's what's remarkable, right? So if I think before I do any of the actions, oh, I'm going to throw the blood for the wrong guy, it seems like that's okay. It's only when I think that I'm going to throw the blood for the wrong guy at one of these 4 moments that it will become a problem.
So you could think about it another time and it'd be okay.
Then it would be okay, right? It's only specifically at these 4 moments.
And who knows what the Kohen is thinking, except the Kohen.
So we're going to get to whether or not maybe the person actually has to, even when we say think, we really mean that he has to say it out loud. That if he says out loud, I'm going to be throwing the blood of this sacrifice that I'm about to sacrifice, that I'm about to slaughter for Shlomo, and then it turns out that the sacrifice belongs to Joe, so then that would be a situation where we would need to then it would be a problem. So you're right to raise the question of how do we know what he's thinking about? The other possibility is that he admits it. He says, "Oh my gosh, I was thinking that I was supposed to I was bringing it for Shlomo when it turns out that it's Joe's. So what am I supposed to do?" So those are the two situations that we could have.
But earlier, when we learned in Horiot, that if a person was thinking, it was enough that, let's say the Cohen didn't have to make he didn't poskin, he didn't have to say, but it was enough that he was thinking that he didn't even have to verbalize it. He himself could have made the ruling for himself.
Correct. Correct.
So that's for him. So no one else really knew that he was making this ruling except himself. So
Correct.
therefore,
Correct.
it's enough that he's thinking it. But how do we here? If we apply the same concept, then how do we know what the Kohen is thinking about bringing the korban for Joe or Shmo or whatever?
Yeah, you're absolutely right. We would there are many situations where we won't actually know. In fact, I can't remember exactly which of the actions, but there is, on Yom Kippur, I think as part of the service, that we understand that some of the atonement that we're trying to get is for atonement for these kinds of things that never got discovered. So you're absolutely right that sometimes it might not be discovered.
Uh-huh.
All right, Yishikoch, have a wonderful day. Looking forward to continuing our learning together.
Bye, sir.